Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 9. When I parted with my brother, for such I am now to call him, we agreed that after I arrived he should pretend to have an account that I was dead in England, and so might marry again when he would. He promised and engaged to correspond with me as a sister, and to assist and support me as long as I lived, and that if he died before me, he would leave sufficient to his mother to take care of me still, in the name of a sister, and he was in some respects careful of me, when he heard of me, but it was so oddly managed that I felt the disappointments very sensibly afterwards, as you shall hear in its time. I came away for England in the month of August, after I had been 8 years in that country, and now a new scene of misfortunes attended me, which perhaps few women have gone through the life of. We had an indifferent good voyage till we came just upon the coast of England, and where we arrived in 32 days, but were then ruffled with 2 or 3 storms, one of which drove us away to the coast of Ireland, and we put in at Kinsale. We remained there about 13 days, got some refreshment on shore, and put to sea again, though we met with very bad weather again, in which the ship sprung her mainmast, as they called it, for I knew not what they meant. But we got at last into Milford Haven, in Wales, where, though it was remote from our port, yet having my foot safe upon firm ground of my native country, the Isle of Britain, I resolved to venture it no more upon the waters, which had been so terrible to me. So getting my clothes and money on shore, with my bills of loading and other papers, I resolved to come for London, and leave the ship to get her port as she could. The port whither she was bound was to Bristol, where my brother's chief correspondent lived. I got to London in about 3 weeks, where I heard a little while after that the ship was arrived in Bristol, but at the same time had the misfortune to know that by the violent weather she had been in, the breaking of her mainmast, she had great damage on board, and that a great part of her cargo was spoiled. I had now a new scene of life upon my hands, and a dreadful appearance it had. I was come away with a kind of final farewell. What I brought with me was indeed considerable, had it come safe, and by the help of it I might have married again tolerably well, but as it was, I was reduced to between 200 or 300 pounds in the whole, and this without any hope of recruit. I was entirely without friends, nay, even so much as without acquaintance, for I found it was absolutely necessary not to revive former acquaintances. As for my subtle friend that set me up formerly for a fortune, she was dead, and her husband also, as I was informed, upon sending a person unknown to inquire. The looking after my cargo of goods soon after obliged me to take a journey to Bristol, and during my attendance upon that affair I took the diversion of going to the bath, for as I was still far from being old, so my humour, which was always gay, continued so to an extreme, and being now, as it were, a woman of fortune, though I was a woman without a fortune, I expected something or other might happen my way that might mend my circumstances, as had been my case before. The bath is a place of gallantry enough, expensive, and full of snares. I went thither, indeed, in view of taking anything that might offer, but I must do myself justice as to protest I knew nothing amiss. I meant nothing but in an honest way, nor had I any thoughts about me at first that looked the way which afterwards I suffered them to be guided. Here I stayed the whole later season, as it is called there, and contracted some unhappy acquaintances, which rather prompted the follies I fell afterwards into than fortified me against them. I lived pleasantly enough, kept good company, that is to say gay, fine company, but had the discouragement to find this way of living sunk me exceedingly, and that, as I had no settled income, so spending upon the main stock was but a certain kind of bleeding to death, and this gave me many sad reflections in the interval of my other thoughts. However, I shook them off, and still flattered myself that something or other might offer my advantage. But I was in the wrong place for it. I was not now at Redriff, where, if I had set myself tolerably up, some honest sea captain or other might have talked with me upon the honourable terms of matrimony, but I was at the Bath, where men find a mistress sometimes, but very rarely look for a wife, and consequently all the particular acquaintances a woman can expect to make there must have some tendency that way. I had spent the first season well enough, for though I had contracted some acquaintance with a gentleman who came to the Bath for his diversion, yet I had entered into no fallacious treaty, as it might be called. I had resisted some casual offers of gallantry, and had managed that way well enough. I was not wicked enough to come into the crime for the mere vice of it, and I had no extraordinary offers made me that tempted me with the main thing which I wanted. However, I went this length the first season, viz., I contracted an acquaintance with a woman in whose house I lodged, who, though she did not keep an ill house, as we call it, yet had none of the best principles in herself. I had on all occasions behaved myself so well as not to get the least slur upon my reputation, on any account whatever, and all the men that I had conversed with were of so good reputation that I had not given the least reflection by conversing with them, nor did any of them seem to think that there was room for a wicked correspondence, if they had any of them offered it. Yet there was one gentleman, as above, who always singled me out for the diversion of my company, as he called it, which, as he was pleased to say, was very agreeable to him, but at that time there was no more in it. I had many melancholy hours at the Bath, after the company was gone, for though I went to Bristol sometime for disposing of my effects, and for recruits of money, yet I chose to come back to Bath for my residence, because being on good terms with the woman in whose house I lodged in the summer, I found that during the winter I lived rather cheaper there than I could anywhere else. Here, I say, I passed the winter as heavily as I had passed the autumn cheerfully, but having contracted a nearer intimacy with the said woman in whose house I lodged, I could not avoid communicating to her something of what lay hardest upon my mind, and particularly the narrowness of my circumstances, and the loss of my fortune by the damage of my goods at sea. I told her also that I had a mother and a brother in Virginia in good circumstances, and as I had really written back to my mother in particular to represent my condition, and the great loss I had received, which indeed came to almost £500, so I did not fail to let my new friend know that I expected a supply from thence, and so indeed I did, and as the ships went from Bristol to York River in Virginia, and back again generally in less time from London, and that my brother corresponded chiefly at Bristol, I thought it was much better for me to wait here for my returns than to go to London, where also I had not the least acquaintance. My new friend appeared sensibly affected with my condition, and indeed was so very kind as to reduce the rate of my living with her to so low a price during the winter that she convinced me she got nothing by me, and as for lodging, during the winter I paid nothing at all. When the spring season came on, she continued to be as kind to me as she could, and I lodged with her for a time, till it was found necessary to do otherwise. She had some persons of character that frequently lodged in her house, and in particular the gentleman who, as I said, singled me out for his companion the winter before, and he came down again with another gentleman in his company and 2 servants, and lodged in the same house. I suspected that my landlady had invited him thither, letting him know that I was still with her, but she denied it, and protested to me that she did not, and he said the same. In a word, this gentleman came down and continued to single me out for his peculiar confidence as well as conversation. He was a complete gentleman, that must be confessed, and his company was very agreeable to me, as mine, if I might believe him, was to him. He made no professions to be but an extraordinary respect, and he had such an opinion of my virtue that, as he often professed, he believed if he should offer anything else, I should reject him with contempt. He soon understood from me that I was a widow, that I had arrived at Bristol from Virginia by the last ships, and that I awaited at Bath till the next Virginia fleet should arrive, by which I expected considerable effects. I understood by him, and by others of him, that he had a wife, but that the lady was distempered in her head, and was under the conduct of her own relations, which he consented to avoid any reflections that might, as was not unusual in such cases, be cast on him for mismanaging her cure. And in the meantime he came to the bath to divert his thoughts from the disturbance of such a melancholy circumstance as that was. My landlady, who of her own accord encouraged the correspondence on all occasions, gave me an advantageous character of him as a man of honour and of virtue, as well as of great estate. And indeed I had a great deal of reason to say so of him too, for though we lodged both on a floor, and he had frequently come into my chamber, even when I was in bed, and I also into his when he was in bed, yet he never offered anything to me further than a kiss, or so much as solicited me to anything till long after, as you shall hear. I frequently took notice to my landlady of his exceeding modesty, and she again used to tell me, she believed it was so from the beginning. However, she used to tell me that she thought I ought to expect some gratification from him for my company, for indeed he did, as it were, engross me, and I was seldom from him. I told her I had not given him the least occasion to think I wanted it, or that I would accept it from him. She told me that she would take that part upon her, and she did so, and managed it so dexterously that the first time we were together alone, after she had talked with him, he began to inquire a little into my circumstances, as how I had subsisted myself since I came on shore, and whether I did not want money. I stood off very boldly. I told him that the merchant that I had been co-signed to had so honestly managed for me that I had not wanted, and that I hoped, with frugal management, I should make it hold out till more would come, which I expected by the next fleet, that in the meantime I had entrenched my expenses, and whereas I kept a maid last season, now I lived without, and whereas I had a chamber and a dining room then on the first floor, as he knew, I now had but one room, 2 pair of stairs, and the like. But I live, said I, as well satisfied now as I did then, adding that his company had been a means to make me live much more cheerfully than otherwise I should have done, for which I was much obliged to him, and so I put off all room for any offer for the present. However, it was not long before he attacked me again, and told me he found that I was backward to trust him with the secret of my circumstances, which he was sorry for, assuring me that he inquired into it with no design to satisfy his own curiosity, but merely to assist me, if there was any occasion. But since I would not own myself to stand in need of any assistance, he had but one thing more to desire of me, and that was that I would promise him that when I was any way straitened, or like it to be so, I would frankly tell him of it, and that I would make use of him with the same freedom that he made the offer, adding that I should always find I had a true friend, though perhaps I was afraid to trust him. I admitted nothing that was fit to be said by one indefinitely obliged, to let him know that I had a due sense of his kindness, and indeed from that time I did not appear so much reserved to him as I had done before, though still within the bounds of the strictest virtue on both sides. But how free soever our conversation was, I could not arrive to that sort of freedom which he desired, to tell him I wanted money, though I was secretly very glad of his offer. Some weeks passed after this, and still I never asked him for money, when my landlady, a cunning creature, who had often pressed me to it, but found that I could not do it, makes a story of her own inventing, and comes in bluntly to me when we were together. "Oh, widow," says she, "I have bad news to tell you this morning." "What is that?" said I. "Are the Virginia ships taken by the French?" For that was my fear. "No, no," says she, "but the man you sent to Bristol yesterday for money is come back, and says he has brought none." Now I could by no means like her project. I thought it looked too much like prompting him, which indeed he did not want, and I clearly saw that I should lose nothing by being backward to ask, so I took her up short. "I can't imagine why he should say so to you," said I, "for I assure you he brought me all the money I sent him for, and here it is," said I, pulling out my purse with about 12 guineas in it, and added, "I intend you shall have most of it by and by." He seemed distasted a little at her talking as she did at first, as well as I, taking it, as I fancied he would, as something forward of her. But when he saw me give such an answer, he came immediately to himself again. The next morning we talked of it again, when I found he was fully satisfied, and smiling, said he hoped I would not want money, and not tell him of it, and that I had promised him otherwise. I told him I had been very much dissatisfied at my landlady's talking so publicly the day before of what she had nothing to do with, but I supposed she wanted what I owed her, which was about 8 guineas, which I had resolved to give her, and had, accordingly, given it to her the same night she talked so foolishly. He was in might good humour when he heard me say I had paid her, and it went off into some other discourse at that time. But the next morning, he having heard me up about my room before him, he called to me, and I, answering, he asked me to come into his chamber. He was in bed when I came in, and he made me come and sit down on his bedside, for he said he had something to say to me which was of some moment. After some very kind expressions, he asked me if I would be very honest to him, and give a sincere answer to one thing he would desire of me. After some cavil at the word sincere, and asking him if I had ever given him any answers which were not sincere, I promised him I would. Why, then, his request was, he said, to let him see my purse. I immediately put my hand into my pocket, and, laughing to him, pulled it out, and there was in it 3 guineas and a half. Then he asked me if there was all the money I had. I told him no, laughing again, not by a great deal. Well then, he said, he would have me promise to go and fetch him all the money I had, every farthing. I told him I would, and I went into my chamber and fetched him a little private drawer, where I had about 6 guineas more, and some silver, and threw it all down upon the bed, and I told him there was all my wealth, honestly, to a shilling. He looked a little at it, but did not tell it, and huddled it into the drawer again, and then, reaching his pocket, pulled out a key, and bade me open a little walnut tree box he had upon the table, and bring him such a drawer, which I did, in which drawer there was a great deal of money in gold, I believe near 200 guineas, but I knew not how much. He took the drawer, and, taking my hand, made me put it in, and take a whole handful. I was backward at that, but he held my hand hard in his hand, and put it in the drawer, and made me take out as many guineas almost as I could take up at once. When I had done so, he made me put them into my lap, and took my little drawer, and poured out all my money among his, and bade me to get me gone, and carry it all home into my own chamber. I related this story the more particularly because of the good humour there was in it, and to show the temper with which we conversed. It was not long after this, but he began every day to find fault with my clothes, and my laces, and head-dresses, and, in a word, pressed me to buy better, in which, by the way, I was willing enough to do, though I did not seem to be so, for I loved nothing in the world better than fine clothes. I told him I must housewife the money he had lent me, or else I should not be able to pay him again. He then told me, in a few words, that as he had a sincere respect for me, and knew my circumstances, he had not lent me that money, but given it to me, and that he thought I had merited it from him by giving him my company so entirely as I had done. After this, he made me take a maid, and keep house, and his friend that came with him to Bath being gone, he obliged me to diet him, which I did very willingly, believing, as it appeared, that I should lose nothing by it, nor did the woman of the house fail to find her account in it too. We had lived thus near 3 months, when, the company beginning to wear away at the Bath, he talked of going away, and fain he would have me go to London with him. I was not very easy in that proposal, not knowing what posture I was to live in there, or how he might use me. But while this was in debate, he fell very sick. He had gone out to a place in Somersetshire, called Shepton, where he had some business, and was there taken very ill, and so ill that he could not travel. So he sent his men back to Bath, to beg me that I would hire a coach and come over to him. Before he went, He had left all his money and other things of value with me, and what to do with them I did not know, but I secured them as well as I could, and locked up the lodgings and went to him, where I found him very ill indeed. However, I persuaded him to be carried in a litter to the bath, where there was more help and better advice to be had. He consented, and I brought him to the bath, which was about 15 miles, as I remember. Here he continued very ill of a fever, and kept his bed 5 weeks, all which time I nursed him and tended him myself, as much and as carefully as I had been his wife. Indeed, if I had been his wife, I could not have done more. I sat up with him so much and so often that at last, indeed, he would not let me sit up any longer, and then I got a pallet bed into his room, and lay in it just at his bed's feet. I was indeed sensibly affected with his condition, and with the apprehension of losing such a friend as he was, and was like to be to me, and I used to sit and cry by him many hours together. However, at last he grew better, and gave hopes that he would recover, as indeed he did, though very slowly. Were it otherwise than what I am going to say, I should not be backward to disclose it, as it is apparent that I have done in other cases in this account. But I affirm that through all of this conversation, abating the freedom of coming into the chamber when I or he was in bed, and abating the necessary offices of attending him night and day when he was sick, there had not passed the least immodest word or action between us. Oh, that it had been so to the last! After some time he gathered strength and grew well apace, and I would have removed my pallet bed, but he would not let me, till he was able to venture himself without anybody to sit up with him, and then I removed to my own chamber. He took many occasions to express his sense of tenderness and concern for him, and when he grew quite well, he made me a present of 50 guineas for my care and, as he called it, for hazarding my life to save his. And now he made deep protestations of a sincere, inviolable affection for me, but all along attested it to be with the utmost reserve for my virtue and his own. I told him I was fully satisfied of it. He carried it that length that he protested to me, that if he was naked in bed with me, he was as sacredly preserved my virtue as he would defend it if I was assaulted by a ravisher. I believed him, and told him I did so, but this did not satisfy him. He would, he said, wait for some opportunity to give me an undoubted testimony of it. It was a great while after this that I had occasion, on my own business, to go to Bristol, upon which he hired me a coach, and would go with me, and did so. And now indeed our intimacy increased. From Bristol he carried me to Gloucester, which was merely a journey of pleasure, to take the air, and here it was our hap to have no lodging in the inn, but in one large chamber with 2 beds in it. The master of the house going up with us to show his rooms, and coming into that room, said very frankly to him, "Sir, it is none of my business to inquire whether the lady be your spouse or no, but if not, you may lie as honestly as these 2 beds as if you were in 2 chambers." And with that he pulls a great curtain, which drew quite across the room, and effectually divided the beds. "Well," says my friend, very readily, "these beds will do, and as for the rest, we are too near akin to lie together, though we may lodge near one another." And this put an honest face on the thing too. When we came to go to bed, he decently went out of the room till I was in bed, and then went to bed in the bed on his own side of the room, but lay there talking to me a great while. At last, repeating his usual saying that he could lie naked in the bed with me and not offer me the least injury, he starts out of his bed. "And now, my dear," says he, "you shall see how just I will be to you, and that I can keep my word." And away he comes to my bed. I resisted a little, but I must confess I should not have resisted him much if he had not made those promises at all, so after a little struggle, as I said, I lay still and let him come to bed. When he was there he took me in his arms, and so I lay all night with him, but he had no more to do with me, or offered anything to me, other than embracing me, as I say, in his arms. No, not the whole night, but rose up and dressed him in the morning, and left me as innocent for him as I was the day I was born. This was a surprising thing to me, and perhaps may be so to others, who know how the laws of nature work, for he was a strong, vigorous, brisk person, nor did he act thus on a principle of religion at all, but of mere affection, insisting on it, that though I was to him the most agreeable woman in the world, yet, because he loved me, he could not injure me. I own it was a noble principle, but as it was that I was never understood before, so it was to me perfectly amazing. We travelled the rest of the journey as we did before, and came back to the bath, where, as he had opportunity to come to me when he would, he often repeated the moderation, and I frequently lay with him, and he with me, and although all the familiarities between man and wife were common to us, yet he never once offered to go any further, and he valued himself much upon it. I do not say that I was so wholly pleased with it as he thought I was, for I own much wickeder than he, as you shall hear presently. End of section 9. This recording is in the public domain.
Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 10. We lived thus near 2 years, only with this exception, that he went 3 times to London in that time, and once he continued there 4 months. But, to do him justice, he always supplied me with money to subsist me very handsomely. Had we continued thus, I confess we had had much to boast of. But, as wise men say, it is ill venturing too near the brink of a command, so we found it. And here again I must do him the justice to own that the first breach was not on his part. It was one night that we were in bed together, warm and merry, and having drunk, I think, a little more wine that night, both of us, than usual, although not in the least to disorder either of us, when, after some other follies which I cannot name, and being clasped close in his arms, I told him, I repeat it with shame and horror of soul, that I could find in my heart to discharge him of his engagement for 1 night, and no more. He took me at my word immediately, and after that there was no resisting him, neither indeed had I any mind to resist him any more, let what would come of it. Thus the government of our virtue was broken, and I exchanged the place of friend for that unmusical, harsh-sounding title of whore. In the morning we were both at our penitentials. I cried very heartily. He expressed himself very sorry. But that was all either of us could do at the time, and the way being thus cleared, and the bars of virtue and conscience thus removed, we had the less difficult afterwards to struggle with. It was but a dull kind of conversation that we had together for all the rest of the week. I looked on him with blushes, and every now and then started that melancholy objection, what if I should be with child now? What will become of me then? He encouraged me by telling me that as long as I was true to him, he would be so to me, and since it was gone such a length, which indeed he never intended, yet if I was with child, he would take care of that, and of me too. This hardened us both. I assured him that if I was with child, I would die for want of a midwife rather than name him as the father of it, and he assured me I should never want if I should be with child. These mutual assurances hardened us in the thing, and after this we repeated the crime as often as we pleased, till at length, as I had feared, so it came to pass, and I was indeed with child. After I was sure it was so, and I had satisfied him of it too, we began to think of taking measures for the managing it, and I proposed trusting the secret to my landlady and asking her advice, which he agreed to. My landlady, a woman, as I found, used to such things, made light of it. She said she knew it would come to that at last, and made us very merry about it. As I said above, we found her an experienced old lady at such work. She undertook everything, engaged to procure a midwife and a nurse, to satisfy all inquiries, and bring us off with reputation. And she did so very dexterously indeed. When I grew near my time, she desired my gentleman to go away to London, or make as if he did so. When he was gone, she acquainted the parish officers that there was a lady ready to lie in at her house, but that she knew her husband very well, and gave them, as she pretended, an account of his name, which she called Sir Walter Cleave, telling them he was a very worthy gentleman, and that she would answer for all inquiries and the like. This satisfied the parish officers presently, and I lay in with as much credit as I could have done if I had really been my Lady Cleave, and was assisted in my travail by 3 or 4 of the best citizens' wives of Bath who lived in the neighbourhood, which, however, made me a little more expensive to him. I often expressed my concern about it, but he bid me not to be concerned about it. As he had furnished me very sufficiently with money for the extraordinary expenses of my lying in, I had everything very handsome about me, but did not affect to be gay or extravagant neither. Besides, knowing my own circumstances, and knowing the world as I had done, and that such kind of things do not often last long, I took care to lay up as much money as I could for a wet day, as I called it, making him believe it was all spent upon the extraordinary appearance of things in my lying in. By this means, and including what he had given me above, I had, at the end of my lying in, about 200 guineas by me, including also what was left of my own. I was brought to bed of a fine boy indeed, and a charming child it was. And when he heard of it, he wrote me a very kind, obliging letter about it, and then told me he thought it would look better for me to come away for London as soon as I was up and well, that he had provided apartments for me at Hammersmith, and if I came thither only from London, and then after a little while I should go back to the Bath, and he would go with me. I liked this offer very well, and accordingly hired a coach on purpose, and taking my child and a wet nurse to tend and suckle it, and a maid-servant with me, away I went for London. He met me at Reading in his own chariot, and taking me into that, left the servant and the child in the hired coach, and so he brought me to my new lodgings at Hammersmith, with which I had abundance of reason to be very well pleased, for they were very handsome rooms, and I was very well accommodated. And now I was indeed in the height of what I might call my prosperity, and I wanted nothing but to be a wife, which, however, could not be in this case. There was no room for it, and therefore on all occasions I studied to save what I could, as I have said above, against a time of scarcity, knowing well enough that such things as these do not always continue, that men that keep mistresses often change them, grow weary of them, or jealous of them, or something or other happens to make them withdraw their bounty, and sometimes the ladies that are thus well used are not careful by a prudent conduct to preserve the esteem of their persons, or the nice article of their fidelity, and then they are justly cast off with contempt. But I was secured in this point, for as I had no inclination to change, so I had no manner of acquaintance in the whole house, and so no temptation to look any farther. I kept no company but in the family when I lodged, and with the clergyman's lady at next door, so that when he was absent I visited nobody, nor did he ever find me out of my chamber or parlour. When he came down, if I went anywhere to take the air, it was always with him. The living in this manner with him, and his with me, was certainly the most undesigned thing in the world. He often protested to me that when he first became acquainted with me, and even to the very night when we first broke in upon our rules, he never had the least design of lying with me, that he always had a sincere affection for me, but not the least real inclination to do what he had done. I assured him I never suspected him, that if I had I should not so easily have yielded to the freedom which brought it on, but that it was all a surprise, and was owing to the accident of our having yielded too far to our mutual inclinations that night. And indeed I have often observed since, and leave it as a caution to the readers of this story, that we ought to be cautious of gratifying our inclinations in loose and lewd freedoms, lest we find our resolutions of virtue fail us in this junction when their assistance should be most necessary. It is true, and I have confessed it before, that from the first hour I began to converse with him, I resolved to let him lie with me if he offered it. But it was because I wanted his help and assistance, and I knew no other way of securing him than that. But when were that night together, and, as I have said, had gone such a length, I found my weakness. The inclination was not to be resisted, but I was obliged to yield up all even before he asked it. However, he was so just to me that he never upbraided me with that, nor did he ever express the least dislike of my conduct on any other occasion, but always protested he was as much delighted with my company as he was the first hour we came together. I mean, came together as bedfellows. It is true that he had no wife, that is to say, she was as no wife to him, and so I was in no danger that way, but the just reflections of conscience oftentimes snatch a man, especially a man of sense, from the arms of a mistress, as it did him at last, though on another occasion. On the other hand, though I was not without secret reproaches of my own conscience for the life I led, and that even in the greatest height of the satisfaction I ever took, yet I had the terrible prospect of poverty and starving, which lay on me as a frightful spectre, so that there was no looking behind me. But as poverty brought me into it, so fear of poverty kept me in it, and I frequently resolved to leave it quite off if I could, but come to lay up money enough to maintain me. But these were thoughts of no weight, and whenever he came to me they vanished, for his company was so delightful that there was no being melancholy when he was there. The reflections were all the subject of those hours when I was alone. I lived 6 years in this happy but unhappy condition, in which time I brought him 3 children. But only the first of them lived, and though I removed twice in those 6 years, yet I came back in the 6th year to my first lodgings at Hammersmith. Here it was that I was one morning surprised with a kind but melancholy letter from my gentleman, intimating that he was very ill, and was afraid he should have another fit of sickness, but that his wife's relations being in the house with him, it would not be practicable to have me with him, which, however, he expressed his great satisfaction in, and that he wished I could be allowed to tend and nurse him as I did before. I was very much concerned at this account, and was very impatient to know how it was with him. I waited a fortnight or thereabouts, and heard nothing, which surprised me, and I began to be very uneasy indeed. I think I may say that for the next fortnight I was near to distracted. It was my particular difficulty that I did not know directly where he was, for I understood at first he was in the lodgings of his wife's mother, but having removed myself to London, I soon found, by the help of the direction I had for writing my letters to him, how to inquire after him, and there I found that he was at a house in Bloomsbury, whither he had, a little before he fell sick, removed his whole family, and that his wife and wife's mother were in the same house, though the wife was not suffered to know that she was in the same house with her husband. Here I also soon understood that he was at the last extremity, which made me almost at the last extremity too, to have a true account. One night I had the curiosity to disguise myself like a servant maid, in a round cap and straw hat, and went to the door as sent by a lady of its neighbourhood, where he lived before, and giving master and mistress's service, I said I was sent to know how Mr. did, and how he had rested that night. In delivering this message I got the opportunity I desired, for, speaking with one of the maids, I held a long gossip's tale with her, and had all the particulars of his illness, which I found was a pleurisy, attended with a cough and a fever. She told me also who was in the house, and how his wife was, who by her relation they were in some hopes might recover her understanding. But as to the gentleman himself, in short, she told me the doctors said there was very little hopes of him, that in the morning they thought he had been dying, and that he was but little better then, for they did not expect that he could live over the next night. This was heavy news for me, and I began now to see an end of my prosperity, and to see also that it was very well I had played to good housewife, and secured or saved something while he was alive, for that now I had no view of my own living before me. It lay very heavy upon my mind, too, that I had a son, a fine lovely boy about 5 years old, and no provision made for it, at least that I knew of. With these considerations, and a sad heart, I went home for that evening, and began to cast with myself how I should live, and in what manner to bestow myself for the residue of my life. You may be sure that I could not rest without inquiring again very quickly what was become of him, and not venturing to go myself, I sent several sham messengers, until after a fortnight's waiting longer, I found that there was hopes of his life, though he was still very ill. Then I abated my sending any more to the house, and in some time after I learned in the neighbourhood that he was about house, and then that he was abroad again. I made no doubt then but that I should hear soon of him, and began to comfort myself with my circumstances, being, as I thought, recovered. I waited a week and 2 weeks, and with much surprise and amazement I waited near 2 months, and heard nothing but that, being recovered, he was gone into the country for the air, and for the better recovery after his distemper. After this it was yet 2 more months, and then I understood he was come to his city house again, but still I heard nothing from him. I had written several letters for him, and directed them as usual, and found 2 or 3 of them had been called for, but not the rest. I wrote again in a more pressing manner than ever, and in one of them let him know that I must be forced to wait on him myself, representing my circumstances, the rent of lodgings to pay, and the provision for the child wanting, and my own deplorable condition destitute of subsistence, for his most solemn engagement to take care of and provide for me. I took a copy of this letter, and finding it lay at the house near a month, and was not called for, I found means to have the copy of it put into his own hands at a coffee-house, where I had by inquiry found he used to go. This letter forced an answer from him, by which, though I found I was to be abandoned, yet I found he had sent a letter to me some time before, desiring me to go down to the bath again. Its contents I shall come to presently. It is true that sick beds are the time when such correspondencies as these are looked on with different countenances, as seen with other eyes than we saw them with, or than they appeared with before. My lover had been at the gates of death, and at the very brink of eternity, and, it seems, had been struck with a due remorse, and with sad reflections upon his past life of gallantry and levity, and among the rest criminal correspondence with me, which was neither more nor less than a long-continued life of adultery, and represented itself as it really was, not as it had been formerly thought by him to be, and he looked upon it now with a just and religious abhorrence. I cannot but observe also, and leave it for the direction of my sex in such cases of pleasure, that whenever sincere repentance succeeds such a crime as this, there never fails to attend a hatred of the object, and the more the affection might seem to be before, the hatred will be more in proportion. It will always be so. Indeed, it can be no otherwise, for there cannot be a true and sincere abhorrence of the offence, and the love to the cause of it remain. There will, with an abhorrence of the sin, be found a detestation of the fellow sinner. You can expect no other. I found it so here, through good manners and justice in this gentleman, kept him from carrying it on to the extreme, but the short history of his part in this affair was thus. He perceived by my last letter, and by all the rest which he went for after, that I was not gone to Bath, that his first letter had not come to my hand, upon which he writes to me this following. Madam, I am surprised that my letter dated the 8th of last month did not come to your hand. I give you my word it was delivered at your lodgings, and to the hands of your maid. I need not acquaint you with what has been my condition for some time past, and how, having been at the edge of the grave, I am, by the unexpected and undeserved mercy of heaven, restored again. In the condition I have been in, it cannot be strange to you that our unhappy correspondence had not been the least of the burdens which lay upon my conscience. I need say no more. Those things that must be repented of must also be reformed. I wish you would think of going back to the Bath. I enclose you here a bill for £50 for clearing yourself at your lodgings and carrying you down, and hope it will be no surprise to you to add that on this account only, and not for any offence given me on your side, I can see you no more. I will take due care of the child, leave him where he is, or take him with you, as you please. I wish you like the reflections, and that they may be to your advantage. I am, etc. I was struck with this letter as with 1,000 wounds, such as I cannot describe. The reproaches of my own conscience were such as I cannot express, for I was not blind to my own crime, and I reflected that I might, with less offence, have continued with my brother, and lived with him as a wife, since there was no crime in our marriage on that score, neither of us knowing it. But I never once reflected that I was all this while a married woman, a wife to Mr. the linen-draper, who, though he had left me by the necessity of his circumstances, had no power to discharge me from the marriage contract which was between us, or to give me a legal liberty to marry again, so that I had been no less than a whore and an adulteress all this while. I then reproached myself for the liberties I had taken, and how I had been a snare to this gentleman, and that indeed I was principal in the crime. That now he was mercifully snatched out of the gulf by a convincing work upon his mind, but that I was left as if I was forsaken of God's grace, and abandoned by heaven to a continuing in my wickedness. Under these reflections I continued very pensive and sad for near a month, and did not go down to the bath, having no inclination to be with the woman whom I was with before, lest, as I thought, she should prompt me to some wicked course of life again, as she had done, and besides I was very loath that she should know I was cast off as above. And now I was greatly perplexed about my little boy. It was death to me to part with a child, and yet when I considered the danger of being one time or other left with him to keep without a maintenance to support him, I then resolved to leave him where he was. But then I concluded also to be near him myself too, that I then might have the satisfaction of seeing him without the care of providing for him. I sent my gentleman a short letter, therefore, that I had obeyed his orders in all things but that of going back to the bath, which I could not think of for many reasons, that however parting from him was a wound to me that I could never recover, yet I was fully satisfied his reflections were just, and would be very far from desiring to obstruct his reformation or repentance. Then I represented my own circumstances to him in the most moving terms that I was able. I told him that those unhappy distresses which first moved him to a generous and honest friendship for me would, I hope, move him to a little concern for me now, though the criminal part of our correspondence, which I believed neither of us intended to fall into at the time, was broken off. That I desired to repent as sincerely as he had done, but entreated him to put me in some condition that I might not be exposed to the temptations which the devil never fails to excite us to from the frightful prospect of poverty and distress. And if he had the least apprehensions of my being troublesome to him, I begged he would put me in a posture to go back to my mother in Virginia, from which he knew I came, and that would put an end to all his fears on that account. I concluded that if he would send me £50 more to facilitate my going away, I would send him back a general release, and would promise never to disturb him with any more importunities, unless it was to hear of the well-doing of the child, whom, if I found my mother living and my circumstances able, I would send for to come over with me, and take him also effectually off his hands. This was indeed all a cheat thus far, viz. That I had no intention to go to Virginia, as the account of my former affairs there may convince anybody of, but the business was to get this last £50 off him if possible, knowing well enough that it would be the last penny I was ever to expect. However, the argument I used, namely, of giving him a general release and never troubling him any more, prevailed effectually with him, and he sent me a bill for the money by a person who brought with him a general release for me to sign, and which I frankly signed, and received the money, and thus, though full sore against my will, a final end was put to this affair. And here I cannot but reflect upon the unhappy consequence of two great freedoms between persons stated as we were, upon the pretence of innocent intentions, love or friendship, and the like, for the flesh has generally so great a share in these friendships that is great odds but inclination prevails at last over the most solemn resolutions, and that vice breaks in at the breaches of decency, which really innocent friendships ought to preserve with the greatest strictness. But I leave the readers of these things to their own just reflections, which they will be more able to make effectual than I, who soon forgot myself, and am therefore but a very indifferent monitor. End of section 10.
Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 11. I was now a single person again, as I may call myself. I was loosed from all the obligations either of wedlock or mistressship in the world, except my husband the linen-draper, whom, I having not now heard from in almost 15 years, nobody could blame me for thinking myself entirely freed from, seeing also he had at his going away told me that if I did not hear frequently from him, I should conclude he was dead, and I might freely marry again to whom I pleased. I now began to cast up my accounts. I had by many letters and much importunity, and with the intercession of my mother too, had a second return of some goods from my brother, as I now call him, in Virginia, to make up the damage of the cargo I brought away with me, and this too was upon the condition of my sealing a general release to him, and to send it him by his correspondent at Bristol, which, though I thought hard of, yet I was obliged to promise to do. However, I managed so well in this case that I got my goods away before the release was signed, and then I always found something or other to say to evade the thing, and to put off the signing it at all, till at length I pretended I must write to my brother, and have his answer before I could do it. Including this recruit, and before I got the last £50, I found my strength to amount, put all together, to about £400, so that with that I had about £450. I had saved above £100 more, but I met with a disaster with that, which was this, that a goldsmith in whose hands I had trusted it broke. So I lost £70 of my money, the man's composition not making above £30 out of his £100. I had a little plate, but not much, and was well enough stocked with clothes and linen. With this stock I had the world to begin again. But you are to consider that I was not now the same woman as when I lived at Redriff, for, first of all, I was near 20 years older, and did not look the better for my age, nor for my rambles to Virginia and back again. And though I omitted nothing that might set me out to advantage, except painting, for that I never stooped to, and had pride enough to think I did not want it, yet there would always be some difference seen between 25 and 42. I cast about innumerable ways for my future state of life, and began to consider very seriously what I should do. But nothing offered. I took care to make the world take me for something more than I was, and had it given out that I was a fortune, and that my estate was in my own hands, the last of which was very true. The first of it was as above. I had no acquaintance, which was one of my worst misfortunes, and the consequence of that was, I had no adviser, at least one who could assist and advise together, and, above all, I had nobody to whom I could in confidence commit the secret of my circumstances to, and could depend upon for their secrecy and fidelity. And I found by experience that to be friendless in the worst condition, next to being in want that a woman can be reduced to, I say a woman, because 'tis evident men can be their own advisers, and their own directors, and know how to work themselves out of difficulties and into business better than women. But if a woman has no friend to communicate her affairs to, and to advise and assist her, 'tis 10 to 1 but she is undone. Nay, and the more money she has, the more danger she is in of being wronged and deceived, and this was my case in the affair of the £100 which I left in the hands of the goldsmith, as above, whose credit, it seems, was upon the ebb before. But I, that had no knowledge of things and nobody to consult with, knew nothing of it, and so lost my money. In the next place, when a woman is thus left desolate and void of counsel, she is just like a bag of money or a jewel dropped on the highway, which is a prey to the next comer. If a man of virtue and upright principles happens to find it, he will have it cried, and the owner may come to hear of it again. But how many times shall such a thing fall into hands that will make no scruple of seizing it for their own, to once that it shall come into good hands? This was evidently my case, for I was now a loose, unguided creature, and had no help, no assistance, no guide for my conduct. I knew what I aimed at, and what I wanted, but knew nothing how to pursue the end by direct means. I wanted to be placed in a settled state of living, and had I happened to meet with a sober, good husband, I should have been as faithful and true a wife to him as virtue itself could have formed. If I had been otherwise, the vice came in always at the door of necessity, not at the door of inclination, and I understood too well by the want of it what the value of a settled life was, to do anything to forfeit the felicity of it. Nay, I should have made the better wife for all the difficulties I had passed through, by a great deal. Nor did I, in any of the time that I had been a wife, given my husbands the least uneasiness on account of my behavior. But all this was nothing. I found no encouraging prospect. I waited, I lived regularly, and with as much frugality as became my circumstances, but nothing offered, nothing presented, and the main stock wasted apace. What to do I knew not. The terror of approaching poverty lay hard upon my spirits. I had some money, but where to place it I knew not, nor would the interest of it maintain me, at least not in London. At length a new scene opened. There was in the house where I lodged a north country woman, that went for a gentlewoman, and nothing was more frequent in her discourse than her account of the cheapness of provisions, and the easy way of living in her country, how plentiful and how cheap everything was, what good company they kept, and the like, till at last I told her she almost tempted me to go and live in her country, for I that was a widow, though I had sufficient to live on, yet had no way of increasing it, and that I found I could not live here under £100 a year, unless I kept no company, no servant, made no appearance, and buried myself in privacy, as if I was obliged to it by necessity. I should have observed that she was always made to believe, as everybody else was, that I was a great fortune, or at least that I had 3,000 or 4,000 pounds, if not more, and all in my own hands. And she was mighty sweet upon me, when she thought me inclined in the least to go into her country. She said she had a sister lived near Liverpool, that her brother was a considerable gentleman there, and had a great estate also in Ireland, that she would go down there in about 2 months, and if I would give her my company thither, I should be as welcome as herself for a month or more as I pleased, till I should see how I liked the country, and if I thought fit to live there, she would undertake they would take care, though they did not entertain lodgers themselves. They would recommend me to some agreeable family, where I should be placed to my content. If this woman had known my real circumstances, she would never have laid so many snares, and taken so many weary steps to catch a poor desolate creature, that was good for little when it was caught. And indeed I, whose case was almost desperate, and thought I could not be much worse, was not very anxious about what might befall me, provided they did me no personal injury. So I suffered myself, though not without a great deal of invitation and great professions of sincere friendship and real kindness. I say I suffered myself to be prevailed upon to go with her, and accordingly I packed up my baggage, and put myself in a posture for a journey, though I did not absolutely know whither I was to go. And now I found myself in great distress. What little I had in the world was all in money, except as before, a little plate, some linen, and my clothes. As for my household stuff, I had little or none, for I had lived always in lodgings, but I had not one friend in the world with whom to trust that little I had, or to direct me how to dispose of it, and this perplexed me night and day. I thought of the bank, and of the other companies in London, but I had no friend to commit the management of it to, and keep and carry about with me bank bills, tallies, orders, and such things. I looked upon it as unsafe, that if they were lost, my money was lost, and then I was undone, and, on the other hand, I might be robbed and perhaps murdered in a strange place for them. This perplexed me strangely, and what to do I knew not. It came in my thoughts one morning that I would go to the bank myself, where I had often been to receive the interest of some bills I had, which had interest payable on them, and where I found a clerk to whom I applied myself, very honest and just to me, and particularly so fair one time that when I had mistold my money, and taken less than my due, and was coming away, he set me to rights, and gave me the rest, which he might have put into his own pocket. I went to him and represented my case very plainly, and asked if he would trouble himself to be my adviser, who was a poor friendless widow, and knew not what to do. He told me if I desired his opinion of anything within the reach of his business, he would do his endeavour that I should not be wronged, but that he would also help me to a good sober person who was a grave man of his acquaintance, who was a clerk in such business too, though not in their house, whose judgment was good, and whose honesty I might depend upon. For, added he, I will answer for him, and for every step he takes. If he wrongs you, madam, of 1 farthing, it shall lie at my door. I will make it good. And he delights to assist people in such cases. He does it as an act of charity. I was a little at a stand in this discourse, but after some pause I told him I had rather have depended upon him, because I had found him honest, but if that could not be, I would take his recommendation sooner than any one else's. I dare say, madam, says he, that you will be as well satisfied with my friend as with me, and he is thoroughly able to assist you, which I am not. It seems he had his hands full of the business of the bank, and had engaged to meddle with no other business than that of his office, which I heard afterwards, but did not understand then. He added that his friend should take nothing of me for his advice or assistance, and this indeed encouraged me very much. He appointed the same evening, after the bank was shut and business over, for me to meet him and his friend, and indeed as soon as I saw his friend, and he began but to talk of the affair, I was fully satisfied that I had a very honest man to deal with. His countenance spoke it, and his character, as I heard afterwards, was everywhere so good that I had no room for any more doubts upon me. After the first meeting, in which I only said what I had said before, we parted, and he appointed me to come the next day to him, telling me I might in the meantime satisfy myself of him by inquiry, which, however, I knew not how well to do, having no acquaintance myself. Accordingly I met him the next day, when I entered more freely with him into my case. I told him my circumstances at large, that I was a widow come over from America, perfectly desolate and friendless, that I had a little money, and but a little, and was almost distracted for fear of losing it, having no friend in the world to trust with the management of it, that I was going into the north of England to live cheap, that my stock might not waste, that I would willingly lodge my money in the bank, but that I durst not carry the bills about me, and the like, as above, and how to correspond with it or with whom I knew not. He told me I might lodge the money in the bank as an account, and its being entered into the books would entitle me to the money at any time, and if I was in the north, I might draw bills on the cashier and receive it when I would, but that then it would be esteemed as running cash, and the bank would give no interest for it, that I might buy stock with it, and so it would lie in store for me, but that then if I wanted to dispose of it, I must come up to town on purpose to transfer it, and even it would be with some difficulty I should receive the half-yearly dividend, unless I was here in person, or had some friend I could trust with having the stock in his name to do it for me, and that would have the same difficulty in it as before. And with that he looked hard at me and smiled a little. At last says he, "Why do you not get a head steward, madam, that may take you and your money together into keeping, and then you would have the trouble taken off your hands?" "Ay, sir, and the money too, it may be," said I, "for truly I find the hazard that way is as much as 'tis t'other way." But I remember I said secretly to myself, "I wish you would ask me the question fairly. I would consider very seriously on it before I said no." He went on a good way with me, and I thought once or twice he was in earnest, but to my real affliction I found at last he had a wife. But when he owned he had a wife, he shook his head and said with some concern that indeed he had a wife and no wife. I began to think he had been in the condition of my late lover, and that his wife had been distempered or lunatic, or some such thing. However, we had not much more discourse at that time, But he told me he was in too much hurry of business then, but that if I would come home to his house after their business was over, he would by that time consider what might be done for me, to put my affairs in a posture of security. I told him I would come, and desired to know where he lived. He gave me a direction in writing, and when he gave it me, he read it to me and said, "There 'tis, madam, if you dare trust yourself with me." "Yes, sir," said I. "I believe I may venture to trust you with myself, for you have a wife, you say, and I don't want a husband. Besides, I dare trust you with my money, which is all I have in the world, and if that were gone, I may trust myself anywhere." He said some things in jest that were very handsome and mannerly, and would have pleased me very well if they had been in earnest. But that passed over. I took the directions, and appointed to attend him at his house at 7 o'clock the same evening. When I came, he made several proposals for my placing my money in the bank, in order to my having interest for it, but still some difficulty or other came in the way, which he objected as not safe, and I found such a sincere, disinterested honesty in him, that I began to muse with myself that I had certainly found the honest man I wanted, and that I could never put myself into better hands. So I told him with a great deal of frankness that I had never met with a man or woman yet that I could trust, or in whom I could think myself safe, but that I saw he was so disinterestedly concerned for my safety, that I said I would freely trust him with the management of that little I had, if he would accept to be steward for a poor widow that could give him no salary. He smiled, and, standing up with great respect, saluted me. He told me he could not but take it very kindly that I had so good an opinion of him, that he would not deceive me, that he would do anything in his power to serve me, and expect no salary, but that he could not by any means accept of a trust, that it might bring him to be suspected of self-interest, and that if I should die he might have disputes with my executors, which he should be very loath to encumber himself with. I told him if those were all his objections, I would soon remove them, and convince him that there was not the least room for any difficulty, for that first, as for suspecting him, if ever I should do it, now is the time to suspect him, and not put the trust into his hands, and whenever I did suspect him, he could but throw it up then, and refuse to go any further. Then as to executors, I assured him I had no heirs, nor any relations in England, and I should alter my condition before I died, and then his trust and trouble should cease together, which, however, I had no prospect of yet. But I told him if I died as I was, it should be all his own, and he would deserve it by being so faithful to me as I was satisfied he would be. He changed his countenance at this discourse, and asked me how I came to have so much good will for him, and, looking very much pleased, said he might very lawfully wish he was a single man for my sake. I smiled, and told him, as he was not, my offer could have no design upon him in it, and to wish, as he did, was not to be allowed. 'Twas criminal to his wife. He told me I was wrong, for, says he, "Madam, as I said before, I have a wife and no wife, and 'twould be no sin to me to wish her hanged, if that were all." "I know nothing of your circumstances that way, sir," said I, "but it cannot be innocent to wish your wife dead." "I tell you," says he again, "she is a wife and no wife. You don't know what I am, or what she is." "That's true," said I, "sir, I do not know what you are, but I believe you to be an honest man, and that's the cause of all my confidence in you." "Well, well," says he, "and so I am, I hope, too. But I am something else, too, madam, for," says he, "to be plain with you, I am a cuckold, and she is a whore." He spoke it in a kind of jest, but it was with such an awkward smile that I perceived it was what struck very close to him, and he looked dismally when he said it. "That alters the case indeed, sir," said I, "as to that part you were speaking of. But a cuckold, you know, may be an honest man, it does not alter that case at all. Besides, I think, said I, since your wife is so dishonest to you, you are too honest to her to own her for your wife. But that, said I, is what I have nothing to do with. Nay, says he, I do not think to clear my hands of her, for, to be plain with you, madam, added he, I am no contented cuckold neither. On the other hand, I assure you it provokes me the highest degree, but I can't help myself. She that will be a whore will be a whore. I waived the discourse, and began to talk of my business, but I found he could not have done with it, so I let him alone, and he went on to tell me all the circumstances of his case, too long to relate here, particularly that, having been out of England some time before he came to the post he was in, she had had 2 children in the meantime by an officer of the army, and that when he came to England, and upon her submission, took her again, and maintained her very well, yet she ran away from him with a linen-draper's apprentice, robbed him of what she could come at, and continued to live from him still. So that, madam, says he, she is a whore, not by necessity, which is the common bait of your sex, but by inclination, and for the sake of the vice. Well, I pitied him, and wished him well rid of her, and still would have talked of my business, but it would not do. At last he looked steadily at me. Look you, madam, says he, you came to ask advice of me, and I will serve you as faithfully as if you were my own sister. But I must turn the tables, since you oblige me to do it, and are so friendly to me, and I think I must ask advice of you. Tell me, what must a poor abused fellow do with a whore? What can I do to do myself justice upon her? Alas, sir, says I, 'tis a case too nice for me to advise in, but it seems she has run away from you, so you are rid of her fairly. What can you desire more? Aye, she is gone indeed, said he, but I am not clear of her for all that. That's true, says I. She may indeed run you into debt, but the law has furnished you with methods to prevent that also. You may cry her down, as they call it. No, no, says he, that is not the case neither. I have taken care of all that. 'Tis not that part that I speak of, but I would be rid of her so that I might marry again. Well, sir, says I, then you must divorce her, if you can prove what you say. You may certainly get that done, and then, I suppose, you are free. That's very tedious and expensive, says he. Why, says I, if you can get any woman you like to take your word, I suppose your wife would not dispute the liberty with you that she takes herself. Aye, says he, but 'twould be hard to bring an honest woman to do that. And for the other sort, says he, I have had enough of her to meddle with any more whores. It occurred to me presently, I would have taken your word with all my heart if you had but asked me the question, but that was to myself. To him I replied, Why, you shut the door against any honest woman excepting you, for you condemn all that should venture upon you at once, and conclude that really a woman that takes you now can't be honest. Why, says he, I wish it would satisfy me that an honest woman would take me. I'd venture it. And then he turned short upon me. Will you take me, madam? That's not a fair question, says I. After what you have said, however, lest you should think I wait only for a recantation of it, I shall answer you plainly. No, not I. My business is of another kind with you, and I did not expect you would have turned my serious application to you, in my own distracted case, into a comedy. Why, madam, says he, my case is as distracted as yours can be, and I stand in as much need of advice as you do, for I think, if I have not relief somewhere, I shall be made myself, and I know not what course to take, I protest to you. Why, sir, says I, 'tis easy to give advice in your case, much easier than it is in mine. Speak, then, says he, I beg of you, for now you encourage me. Why, says I, if your case is so plain as you say it is, you may be legally divorced, and then you may find honest women enough to ask the question of fairly. The sex is not so scarce that you can want a wife. Well then, said he, I am in earnest. I'll take your advice. But shall I ask you one question seriously beforehand? Any question, said I, but that you did before. No, that answer will not do, said he. For, in short, that is the question I shall ask. You may ask what questions you please, but you have my answer to that already, said I. Besides, sir, said I, can you think so ill of me that as I would give any answer to such a question beforehand? Can any woman alive believe you in earnest, or think you design anything but to banter her? Well, well, says he, I do not banter you. I am in earnest. Consider of it. But, sir, says I, a little gravely, I came to you about my own business. Beg of you to let me know what you will advise me to do. I will be prepared, says he, against you come again. Nay, says I, you have forbid my coming any more. Why so? Said he, and looked a little surprised. Because, said I, you can't expect I should visit you on the account you talk of. Well, says he, you shall promise me to come again, however, and I will not say any more of it till I have gotten the divorce. But I desire you will prepare to be better conditioned when that's done. For you shall be the woman, or I will not be divorced at all. Why, I owe it to your unlooked-for kindness, if it were to nothing else, but I have other reasons, too. He could not have said anything in the world that pleased me better. However, I knew that the way to secure him was to stand off while the thing was so remote, as it appeared to be, and that it was time enough to accept of it when he was able to perform it. So I said very respectfully to him, it was time enough to consider of these things when he was in a condition to talk of them. In the meantime I told him I was going a great way from him, and he would find objects enough to please him better. We broke off here for the present, and he made me promise him to come again the next day. For his resolutions upon my own business, which, after some pressing I did, though, had he seen farther into me, I wanted no pressing on that account. End of Section 11. Recorded by Nicole Doolin. On the web at NicoleDoolin.com.